gostaria de começar dando boas-vindas a todos vocês que nos assistem na tarde e na noite de hoje para conversar sobre recessão democrática, sobre estado e qualidade da democracia no mundo e sobre o impacto da pandemia do novo coronavírus nas nossas democracias. Nosso convidado especial de hoje é o professor Larry Diamond, professor de Sociologia e Ciência Política da Universidade de Stanford, a quem eu tenho a honra de ter conosco nessa próxima 1h30, e também o comentarista junto comigo, o moderador do papo junto comigo, o sempre amigo e sempre parceiro Sérgio Fausto, da Fundação Fernando Henrique Cardoso, também cientista político, e a Fundação é uma das parceiras históricas da RAPS, a quem eu agradeço também a junção e a união para que a gente possa realizar esse debate na noite de hoje. Queria, mais uma vez, cumprimentar a todos vocês e explicar um pouco, de maneira muito breve, a razão pela qual nós estamos aqui hoje. A RAPS é uma organização com 8 anos, que nasceu com uma missão que é muito desafiadora, sobretudo em tempos como o de agora. Nós nascemos com a missão de contribuir para a melhoria da democracia no Brasil e escolhemos fazer isso por meio do apoio e do desenvolvimento de lideranças públicas e políticas que se comprometam com um conjunto de valores e princípios. Essa rede hoje tem mais de 700, quase 700 membros no Brasil inteiro, sendo boa parte dessas pessoas já no exercício de mandatos eletivos. E um dos núcleos, uma das razões principais do nosso trabalho, se relaciona com a qualidade da democracia. A gente escolheu há 8 anos contribuir para a sua melhora, e o que nós estamos encontrando agora no Brasil e no mundo, porque essa não é uma característica exclusivamente do Brasil, é um estado de recessão democrática. E essa expressão é do próprio professor Larry Diamond, que está conosco aqui hoje. Esse estado de recessão democrática, ele se caracteriza por alguns elementos e variáveis, como, por exemplo, perseguição à imprensa, como baixa accountability dos políticos, manifestações da população e mais uma série de indicadores. O fato é, e acho que eu não exagero, que estamos em recessão democrática e estamos experimentando, em diferentes países do mundo, uma piora da qualidade das nossas democracias. Em geral, nos parece que as democracias não conseguiram ainda entregar aquilo que prometeram. Esse é o principal objetivo da nossa conversa de hoje, entender as razões pelas quais isso aconteceu, como é que nós podemos fazer para revitalizar as nossas democracias enquanto ainda é tempo e compreender o impacto da pandemia da Covid-19 no desempenho e na qualidade das democracias. Eu sou Mônica Sodré, passo agora para o Sérgio Fausto, diretor da Fundação Fernando Henrique Cardoso, e espero que tenhamos um ótimo e inspirador bate-papo nas próximas horas. Muito obrigada, Sérgio. Obrigada às equipes das duas organizações. Obrigada ao professor Larry por estar conosco. E a palavra é sua, Sérgio.
Minhas palavras serão breves. A primeira é de agradecimento pela parceria com a RAPS. Agora eu vou falar em inglês. Now I'm turning to English, Larry. And I was trying to find in our website, when were you at the foundation? And you were here May 2017, more than 4 years ago. In those days, it was already clear that we were in a democratic recession, globally speaking. Trump had been elected, Brexit had occurred, Erdogan had slided towards an authoritarian regime in Turkey. Putin was already a strong man in Russia with just a veneer of democratic layer covering Russian institutions. So I think it's time to ask, 4 years after that, whether things have deteriorated further or improved since then in terms of democratic trends globally. Let me just mention the title of your last book, You've published many books. It would be impossible to mention them all in a short period of time. But it's Ill Winds, Saving Democracy from Russian Rage, Chinese Ambition, and American Complacency. And let me just refer to the fact that we are almost on the eve of a crucial presidential election in the US. So given the fact that you were here 4 years ago and we are on the eve of a critical American election, how do you see the democratic recession going forward? Are we entering new and more dangerous territory, or can we be more hopeful in this regard? The floor is yours. We are really excited to hear what you have to say.
Well, thank you, Monica, and thank you, Sergio, and thank you to both of your institutions so much. It's my honor to be with you and to engage your, I'm sure, distinguished audience. I'm going to share my screen now and present if I can, you should be seeing my slides now.
Perfectly
Are
well.
they visible?
Yeah. It's
All
entirely
right,
visible.
so let me start from the beginning and try to begin, Sergio, by answering your question of whether the democratic recession that I believe began, as I'll show in a minute, 14 years ago, is worse now than when I visited earlier in 2017, and the answer is it is worse. This is a slide that shows the trend in terms of the percentage of countries in the world with populations over 1 million that meet the minimal test of electoral democracy. That's the light blue line that you see on top. Rising through the early years of the third wave to the point in the mid-1980s when Brazil had its democratic transition, and by then we'd gone from a quarter of all these states over 1 million being democracies to about a third. And then you can see the exhilarating continuing rise of democracy, the transition in Chile, the transitions in Korea and Taiwan, the end of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Soviet Union. And we got to the point by the early 1990s where for the first time in the history of the world, a majority of the states of the world, over 1 million population, and an even slightly larger majority of all the states of the world, because smaller states tend to be more democratic, were democracies, a majority for the first time in the history of the world. And that expansion gradually, very gradually leveled off, but slightly continued up until around 2005. And you see in 2005 that the percentage of states with over 1 million people who could choose their leaders and replace their leaders in reasonably free and fair elections that were really meaningfully competitive, where people had, you know, the chance to campaign and vote as they please, and the votes were more or less honestly counted, that peaked at 57%. And since 2005, it's been very slowly ebbing back down to 55, 54, 52%. And by the end of last year, it had declined to 48%. This was, in my view, alarming, because as you can see, it was the first time since the very early 1990s, more than a quarter century ago, that we dipped below 50% in terms of the percentage of states over 1 million population that could be said by a standard that was not entirely superficial to be electoral democracies. Now, I want to explain that most of these countries, as I'll discuss in greater detail in a few minutes, were losing democracy not because of a military coup, and not because a ruler like Alberto Fujimori, once he got elected, said, the country's out of control, the system is falling apart, only I can fix it, so I'm closing down Congress and suspending the Constitution. That's not the way it happens these days. We see a more gradual and incremental hollowing out to the point where in a country like Turkey, in a country like Hungary, it can be hard to know when a country has crossed the line from democracy into what we call competitive authoritarianism. But I think this crossing of the line obviously happened many, many years ago, probably the early 2000s in Venezuela and Russia. It happened probably by 2012 or 2014 in Turkey. It happened around then or not long after in Hungary. And I think by last year it had happened in the Philippines as well, which is, you know, a country of nearly 100 million people. It's a very important emerging democracy where you have a populist leader, Rodrigo Duterte, who's been doing the kinds of things that other authoritarian populists have been doing. And of course, we had an electoral crisis in Bolivia that you're probably well familiar with, in which the illiberal populist, we can debate how authoritarian he was, messed with the vote, messed with the country's desire to constrain him from running for yet another term in office. And as a result of the electoral crisis and widespread popular protests, he fled. And I think we still don't have a clear return to democracy in Bolivia. So anyway, that's the first slide. Then secondly, we have here the annual trend in terms of, in each year since the end of the Cold War in 1991, the ratio of countries that are gaining in any given year with respect to freedom, as opposed to the countries that are declining. And this is generated by the annual ratings of political rights and civil liberties of Freedom House, the non-governmental democracy and freedom rating and promotion agency based in Washington, D.C. and New York. And you can see that from the end of the Cold War in 1991 through 2005, in most of these years, really all but about 3, many more countries gained in freedom in any particular year than the number that declined. And the ratio was often more than 2 times as many countries, in 1 year, 3 times as many countries gaining in freedom compared to the number of countries that were declining. And then you see what happened when the democratic recession, in my view, began in 2006. This reversed and the favorable balance disappeared. And then beginning in 2007, and in every year since, only about 50 to 70% as many countries have gained in freedom as the number that have declined. The ratio just flipped. Now let's look at the rate of democratic breakdown. We can take this 40-year period, really I'd say 44 years or 45 years, of the third wave of global democratization and slice it into 4 11-year periods going through the end of last year. And ask, well, in each of these 11-year periods, what percentage of democracies in the world failed during this period of time? And in this first long decade, as the third wave was getting started, the failure rate, as you can see, was nearly 14%. Then in each of the next two 11-year periods, from 1987 to 97, and from 1998 to 2008, the failure rate declined to a little under 11%. And in the last 11-year period, the failure rate has jumped dramatically to nearly 1 in 5 democracies failing from 2009 through 2019. And more than a third of all democracies, 35%, have failed at one time or another in this 44-year period, looking globally. Now, how has the US fared compared to other emerging market democracies in the world, including, you will be interested to know, I've just clicked on it here, Brazil? Freedom House has produced every year since 2005 a 100-point scale of political rights and civil liberties. So we can look and see how a country is doing on a more finely grained scale of 0 to 100, combining political rights, civil liberties, and really they include transparency and the rule of law. And you can see here that in 2005, Brazil started, it's the blue line at bottom here, with a rating of 72, not too far behind the, excuse me, this is the Philippines at 72. Brazil was a little bit better at 77. Then we have Mexico at 80, Israel 83, South Africa at 88. The US and Hungary were tied at 93. That was then, before the democratic recession in 2005. Now, what's happened is that under Duterte, this Philippines is the bottom line here. The Philippines, you can see, has, since Duterte came into power in 2016, declined down to a score of 59. And there was an earlier period of decline under another authoritarian president, Gloria Macapagal Arroyo. So the Philippines is now in a recurrent pattern of democratic decline. Mexico has had a more incremental but steady decline, during this 15-year period, from a pretty good score of 80 in 2005, when you will recall Vicente Fox, the first democratically elected president, was still finishing his 6-year term. And we see the steady deterioration under Calderon, under the PRI successor, and now under Lopez Obrador, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, AMLO, where Mexico has declined down to 62. According to this measure, Brazil isn't so bad. It had improved at one point, up slightly to 78. Now it's down to 75. Israel has declined slightly. The big news is Hungary, of course, has declined dramatically, more so than I think is recognized in this slide. And we see a steady decline in the US from a high of 94 around 2007, 2008, down to 86. And again, I think that the real decline is much lower. We could do these slides for lots of countries in the world, not necessarily all. Germany is holding up very well. Many other European Union countries are holding up very well in terms of democracy, Canada as well. But many are in decline, and the reason, and many are failing, and the reason is why. So these, I think, are some of the big causes, and Sergio, in noting the title of my book, you've already noted some of them. Democracies are performing rather poorly. in many cases in controlling corruption and crime, and in assuring economic fairness and economic security for their inhabitants. This was a major factor in the rise of Duterte in the Philippines, and most populists who win at the ballot box do so with a narrative railing against the corruption of existing elites. I think perceptions of accelerating globalization have heightened this anxiety among voting publics. People are afraid of losing national sovereignty and control. Where there is immigration coming in, challenging more homogeneous culture, maybe in Europe in particular, or at least populists can exploit the fear of this, that enters in. The fear of losing economic sovereignty and losing jobs enters in. The growing role of social media in polarizing political dialogue and political loyalties, and providing a instrumentality for disinformation by domestic and international actors to fan polarization and distrust. The diffusion of authoritarian leadership models across borders, the decline of the United States as a model of democracy seen as worth emulating, and as a country committed to promoting democracy, and then this very, very dangerous rise of Russia and China as authoritarian actors trying to intervene in the politics of other countries. With this, we see the rise of illiberal populism. Politicians like Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, like Viktor Orban in Hungary, like Donald Trump in the United States, Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, and Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. I think all of these actors who initially won office through democratic elections, but who don't always show a commitment to maintaining democracy, foster rhetoric, exemplify actions, and pursue agendas that have the following common features. First of all, they are anti-elitist, and indeed they depict elites as evil, corrupt, and different than ordinary legitimate members of society. Secondly, they are anti-institutionalist, and by this I mean they're anti the democratic institutions and supporting institutions in civil society that constrain the arbitrary power of the populist ruler and his ambitions. And they foment acute popular distrust of existing institutions. The established media, businesses, the courts, liberal civil society organizations, and so on and so forth. Third, and crucially, they're anti-pluralist. Pluralism means a plurality of views and interests, and that we don't have any monistic, hegemonic presumption that only one set of interests, only one political program, only one political formation, party, or leader is legitimate. That in a democracy, we have to recognize the legitimacy of and celebrate political differences, ideological disagreements, divergent parties and programs. Populists reject that and claim that their program, their agenda, their anger, their ambition represents the only legitimate entry into the political arena. And therefore, they are illiberal. They are intolerant of political differences and intolerant of religious, ethnic, or other minorities, including indigenous peoples. Fifth, they're hegemonic, as I've already implied. That is the flip side of anti-pluralism. They literally do claim, and if you look at their language, you can find ample examples of it, to be the only legitimate representative of the true deserving people. And those corrupt, self-serving, established, decadent elites, they represent the non-deserving people, the culturally decadent, globalizing betrayers of the country. Sixth, they don't really believe in representative democracy with its checks and balances and need for negotiation in the parliament over different interests. They believe in plebiscitary democracy, and that is the people vote, they elect a Bolsonaro or a Trump or an Erdogan, and then that leader who's been invested with the only really legitimate power in the country, in their view, should be free to do what he wants, to overrun institutions and put into place the will of the people, of course, as he defines it. And seventh, they tend to be hyper-nationalist, xenophobic, and opposed to global engagement, in part because it brings pluralism, complexity, diversity, and all the things they distrust. These illiberal populists, budding autocrats, as I said, don't generally seize power in one fell swoop through a military or executive coup. They pursue what I've defined in my book as the autocrat's 12-step program. You begin by demonizing and delegitimating the political opposition as undeserving of a place in the political system because they're selfish, morally compromised, decadent, discredited elites. You then move to undermine the independence of the courts, who might present a check on your power. And you try, as Erdogan has done, as Orban has done, as Duterte has been doing, of course, as Hugo Chavez did, to purge the courts and stack them with political loyalists. And then you just go down the checklist of other institutions that you intimidate, cleanse of opposition, purge of dissent, and take over. The media, the conventional media, public broadcasting, if it exists. You try and get control of the internet and constrain internet freedom and pass laws against defamation on the internet. You subdue, as Erdogan has been doing, civil society. There's an agenda that I find very worrisome in India under Narendra Modi in this regard, to intimidate NGOs, universities, think tanks into towing the line and not criticizing the ruler and the ruling party. You intimidate the business community into submission. This is rather easy to do if you get control of the tax authority. You go to businesses and you say, look, you know, we might have a very large tax bill that you have to pay here that might force you into bankruptcy unless you want to stop criticizing me and the ruling party and start supporting us and stop supporting the opposition. And gradually, you just keep squeezing and tightening the noose until you've taken over the state bureaucracy, the security apparatus, rigged the electoral rules as Erdogan and Orban have done, and barricaded yourself in power so that you just repeat steps 1 through 11. The pandemic now presents a kind of made-in-heaven opportunity for these aspiring autocrats or existing autocrats to further tighten restrictions on freedom and create a more authoritarian situation in the name of public health and security. And you can see how different regimes have used the excuse of the COVID-19 pandemic to suspend elections, suspend freedom of movement and assembly, ban the physical printing of newspapers, or ban opposition journalists and critics, prosecute them for disloyalty, heighten news censorship, implement invasive state mobile tracking devices on people's cell phones that might not be removed after the pandemic, and of course, launch a brutal global disinformation campaign against democracy. So we've got to fight back. I have two slides to conclude with. One is how to fight back against authoritarian populism. And the most important lesson I've learned from observing what Democrats have done to regain power in Greece against a left-wing, illiberal populist government, to win municipal power in several cities in Turkey, despite the massive electoral advantages of Erdogan and his Justice and Development Party, and to win the mayorship in Budapest and Prague, and the other electoral gains that democratic forces are making. I think these are the lessons that we all need to bear in mind. Number one, do not play into the polarizing rhetoric or strategy of the illiberal or authoritarian populist. The challenge needs to be to transcend populist polarization and not reinforce it. Therefore, create a big tent politically that speaks to and welcomes in the previous supporters of the authoritarian populist. If you treat everyone who voted for an illiberal populist in the last election as stupid or evil, you're not going to get to the broader coalition that's necessary to push this into retreat. Democrats need to lead. Unfortunately, I would say this is a hard lesson, not with democracy issues, but with bread and butter issues that speak to people's economic and social needs and anxieties and the failures of the populist government. And they're always there sooner or later to deliver. And related to this is the fact that because populism is lacking in respect for institutional constraints, judicial and legislative oversight, pluralism, and the rule of law, inevitably it descends into really serious corruption. And this corruption needs to be exposed, and it needs to be made an issue of. And that can do a lot to discredit the populist ruler and party and mobilize support for the liberal opposition. Democrats can identify reforms to improve democracy, but it's an illusion to think that these alone can be the centerpiece of the campaign. People want to be proud of their country in an age of anxiety about globalization. Nationalism is a resurgent phenomenon. I'd say Democrats need to embrace a civic form of nationalism in which they promote pride in nation, but wed it to pride in democracy and personal freedom, so that the linkage between democracy and pride in country become really inseparable. And it's very important that civil society come together across, and political parties across ideological and personality and other divides to rally around this kind of common agenda. Finally, we should remind ourselves that the real key to fighting the pandemic is not so much democracy versus authoritarianism, but competent versus incompetent government and effective versus ineffective leadership. I've studied politically a little bit what has separated countries like Taiwan and South Korea and New Zealand and Germany from the countries like the United States and Brazil, initially Italy and others that have not done a good job of managing the virus. And it's all about competent government and not, suspicion and rumor mongering. An effective early warning and response system made a big difference in Asia, taking early steps to identify, isolate, and trace contacts among those who might have been infected. We know we need to implement early and widespread testing for the virus, and Trump still has yet to learn this, but it's not enough to test. We need very rapid results, ideally within hours, if the results are going to be able to be useful in isolating people who test positive. Competent governments use big data analytics to track the infection, and strong public health systems to deliver resources to people and to track them. We need, even in federal systems like the US, India, and the United States, strong central government and public health authorities to coordinate information and the delivery of medical supplies. And public health experts need to be put out in front to speak with authority to the public. The messaging really shouldn't be coming from the president on technical matters. It should be coming from doctors with real deep public health experience. That would increase trust in government and in scientific expertise. It would lead, hopefully, to everyone wearing face masks, using hand sanitizers, exercising social distance. We know these are the things that need to be done in order to control the virus. And hopefully out of that would come more affordable and widely accessible healthcare for those who do become infected, and a renewed sense of social solidarity that if we cooperate and don't allow authoritarian populists to divide us, we can both defend our freedom and roll back this terrible virus. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Larry, for this excellent and comprehensive presentation. My head is bubbling with questions, but ladies first. So, Monica, please ask the first question.
Okay, Professor, thank you so much. I'm going to speak in Portuguese as we spoke before. Professor, eu gostaria de explorar inicialmente duas questões, antes de abrir para as do Sérgio e as do público, especialmente sobre os seus slides finais, em que o senhor trata como combater o populismo, né? E aí eu vou fazer primeiro uma interpretação minha das suas informações, para depois fazer as duas perguntas. Eu tenho a impressão de que existe um padrão e um certo método nesses populismos que o senhor menciona. E eles, dentre as características comuns que o senhor também aponta, existe o uso massivo ou maciço de mídias e redes sociais para que essas pessoas possam se comunicar diretamente com os eleitores e também para que a gente está assistindo isso no Brasil, mas isso não é característica exclusiva nossa, para fazer uso de campanhas de desinformação em massa, com o objetivo último de atrapalhar a percepção das pessoas sobre o que é verdadeiro e o que é falso. Isso tem consequências para a democracia, porque afinal democracia tem a ver com confiança e com tomada de decisão, e se, portanto, a informação que chega às pessoas chega com uma qualidade ruim, ou nós não conseguimos, enquanto sociedade, discriminar o que é verdadeiro e o que é falso, isso tem consequências para a tomada de decisão que não são pequenas. Dentro da rede RAPS hoje, como eu mencionei, nós temos um conjunto grande de atores já no exercício de mandatos eletivos. São homens e mulheres nas prefeituras, nas câmaras de vereadores, no Senado Federal. E nós temos um senador, que aliás está nos acompanhando aqui, que tem uma teoria, e eu acho que, e aí eu começo a encaminhar para a minha pergunta, que as redes sociais foram bastante habilidosas, as plataformas de mídias e de redes sociais foram bastante habilidosas em fazer com que o debate fique mais polarizado e mais extremo. Tenho a impressão de que as redes sociais foram muito capazes de movimentar o debate público e mediar o debate público a partir de traços da psicologia humana que nada tem a ver com a tecnologia, como, por exemplo, o viés de confirmação, o fato de que todos nós tendemos a achar que a nossa posição de mundo, a nossa visão está correta e que a dos outros não está. E aí, a partir dessa análise, eu encaminho para as duas perguntas. A primeira delas é se o senhor acredita que, sendo hoje as plataformas e redes sociais moderadoras do debate público e, portanto, hábeis em, não vou dizer exatamente manipular, mas induzir um comportamento mais anti e raivoso por parte dos cidadãos e eleitores, se eventualmente o que pode acabar acontecendo é que os políticos moderados, razoáveis, digamos assim, acabem perdendo espaço na política, acabem ficando de fora do debate público por serem incapazes ou se recusarem justamente a mover o cidadão e o eleitor a partir desses aspectos mais raivosos que os tecnopopulistas parecem ser muito hábeis. Essa é a primeira pergunta. O segundo é, olhando para o caso brasileiro, nós temos evidências hoje de que a campanha eleitoral de 2018 ao Executivo fez uso de campanhas de desinformação em massa, de maneira coordenada. E eu tenho a impressão de que, embora as fake news e a desinformação sejam elementos novos por conta do alcance que a tecnologia proveu, no fim, a nossa discussão deveria ser, neste aspecto específico, como garantir que o dinheiro desequilibre menos o processo eleitoral. No Brasil, nós enfrentamos muito parcialmente essa discussão com uma mudança de legislação em 2015 que proibiu a doação de pessoas jurídicas, de empresas, e me parece que desde 2018 nós, brasileiros, estamos nos deparando com evidências de que o dinheiro continua desequilibrando o jogo eleitoral, mas agora a partir de campanhas de desinformação em massa. Como é que o senhor olha o aspecto do dinheiro, a ligação entre dinheiro e eleições, e como é que o seu país tem lidado com isso, em termos regulatórios ou de outro tipo, e que pode, seja o seu país ou as suas experiências de pesquisa, dos outros objetos de pesquisa, podem inspirar o Brasil a lidar com o fenômeno de fake news, desinformação em massa e desequilíbrio eleitoral provido por conta do dinheiro.
So, I think that these are extremely pertinent questions in the world we live in. And they're very difficult questions because the social media platforms, most of all Facebook, but many of the others, Twitter, WhatsApp, and so on, YouTube, they don't really want to be regulated, understandably. And yet they have become, in some ways, more powerful than the broadcast media, the conventional media. And certainly in the United States, television and radio broadcast media are still regulated. So what to do? I think that it's better if they take the initiative to regulate than if we have legislation to regulate. But if they don't take the initiative, I think we have no choice but to move forward to some sort of legislative initiative. Facebook has taken the first step toward potential regulation of this problem by appointing an independent advisory panel to advise it on content moderation and on what to take down. But whether it will have the capacity to deal with the speed and volume of what needs to be done, that is an issue that we don't have an answer to yet. I think Twitter has been more forward-leaning and responsible. At one point, taking down a Donald Trump tweet because it was so blatantly fallacious and violating of Twitter's rules and principles. And I think the social media companies need to make it clear to politicians that the mere fact that they're politicians doesn't give them immunity in terms of engaging in deliberate, demonstrable, objectively determined falsehoods that have the obvious intent of sowing distrust, polarizing the electorate, and damaging the integrity or civility of democracy. So the best approach would be for each corporate platform to implement pretty serious, thoughtful, and forward-leaning efforts to vet their content, to remove blatantly, or at least prominently flag as inconsistent with the evaluation of objective experts, the content that politicians are putting on there, to remove the most dangerously inflammatory content, and to make clear that they, even at some risk to their corporate bottom line, that they won't be a vehicle for that. If they don't do that, I think we need to think about what role regulation can play. The problem is, anytime you move toward regulation, you can open the door to censorship. And if you appoint an independent commission today, and then a populist gets elected and manages to get a hold of the independent commission, the way populists have gotten a hold of, say, public broadcasting and the courts, then they can use it as a vehicle to censor social media and to censor the ability of liberal critics of them to criticize them over social media. So you've got to be careful about that. With respect to campaign donations, I believe in radical transparency, and there needs to be immediate reporting of all online campaign donations, and also all online political advertising should be immediately disclosed, and no social media company should be allowed to post a campaign ad on the internet that is accessible to a particular country in advance of an election, unless the true source of funding for the political ad is determined and revealed. We have something in the United States that's been introduced in our Congress that is to that effect. It's called the Honest Ads Act, and it's being blocked by some Republicans in the Congress who apparently are not interested in ensuring that we always have honest ads.
Larry, let me piggyback on Monica's question about the social media, and my question is the following: there are abundant evidence of Russian interference in the American elections of 2016 through social media, through the dissemination of polarizing news, fake news, and the sort. I want you to elaborate on how does authoritarian superpowers, both China and Russia, how do they use social media to penetrate the domestic political system of democratic countries. How does this, and if their strategy and objectives are the same,
No.
Chinese and Russian. And associated to that, I want to hear your assessment about how vulnerable the US political system still is today to foreign interference through social media.
So I think Russia and China work in somewhat distinct ways. Russia has been more aggressive and specific and skillful, and in a way I would say organic in its social media intervention by launching this factory in St. Petersburg called the Internet Research Agency that has hired, sponsored, organized an army of trolls to assume fake identities, American identities, set up fake Twitter and Facebook accounts, and then claim to be Black Americans who, you know, are radical believers in social justice for Blacks, and they're so radical they think Blacks shouldn't vote because the whole system is corrupt. And others who think that Black Lives Matter is a fraud, and then they try and pit the two groups against one another. I think we can expect this time, there was some of this in 2016, I expect more of this in 2020, that these Russian actors will try in very targeted ways to spread disinformation about the voting process itself. So they may go into African American or Latino websites, claim to be members of that community and say, well, we have to be sure to vote, you know, and then give the name and address of a fake polling station. So people go there and they're not able to vote. That's an example of disinformation. Or give erroneous instructions on how to cast a mail ballot in a way that will lead people to disqualify their mail ballot. Or I can think of a thousand other ways they could promote cynicism or you know, undermine the integrity of the electoral process, including what we know Russia did in 2016, which is infiltrate the voter registration databases of all 50 states. Well, last time they broke into the databases and apparently didn't do anything to sabotage them. This time, maybe they'll knock, you know, every seventh Latino name off the voter register so that when they go to vote in some states, they won't find their names on the voter register at the polls, things like that. So it's both social media intervention and fraud and polarization and stimulating of anger and outrage and so on. And it's also deliberate fraud, intimidation, and undermining of the integrity of the vote. And then, you know, you've got the doxing, the stealing of documents and trying to spin those into a scandal. China hasn't been doing any of that we know of. The Chinese strategy is more in terms of global propaganda, in terms of putting out a narrative about the United States as ineffective and decadent, and democracy isn't working and so on. But the Chinese either haven't made a decision to intervene in such a fine-grained, subtle way in the American electoral process, or they don't know how to do it with the skill that Russia doesn't mean they won't try in the future. Then there's a debate about, you know, who each country wants. There's little doubt, and we have more recent reports from the intelligence authorities that Russia helped Trump to be elected and now wants to help him be reelected. China, it appears, may be wishing for Biden to be elected, though if you think about it, they should be hoping that Trump will be reelected because he's done a pretty good job of unilaterally dismantling American power and credibility in the world, and that opens the door for China to assert itself in terms of global leadership.
I want to delve into the, let's say, the domestic failures of democratic regimes and focus on the U.S. Let me put it in a provocative way. Which is the biggest threat to democracy in the U.S., Russia or Donald Trump?
Oh, I think unambiguously Donald Trump. Now, the two are joined at the hip, so it's hard to separate them. And Russia is clearly working to try and, as I said, I don't think there's any doubt about this. It's certainly the unanimous conclusion of our intelligence agencies working once again to try and elect Donald Trump. But there's a limit to the damage that Russia can do on its own, and Russia wouldn't have the scope to do this damage if it weren't for the fact that they have Donald Trump to support and promote and quote and use in their various digital and geopolitical efforts. But it's Donald Trump, not the Russians, who's trying to destroy the US Postal Service in order to prevent people from voting by mail. It's Donald Trump, not the Russians, who has been resisting the signing of bills that would allocate the necessary funding that our state and local electoral administrations need to update their counting machines and their voting procedures. It's Donald Trump that's in daily fashion sowing doubt about whether we'll have a free and fair election in November, and suggesting that if there are mail-in ballots, the vote is going to be rigged. It's Donald Trump who has been firing, I think now, 5 inspectors general of different agencies who have been investigating fraud and abuse of power in several different cabinet departments in the United States. It's Donald Trump who has been violating federal laws against the use of public office for personal financial gain. These are not things that Russia is doing. These are things that the incumbent president of the United States is doing. And all of these things and more would be impeachable offenses and should have resulted in the impeachment and removal of Trump, but for the success that Trump has had in intimidating members of the Republican Party into quietly going along with this, even though most of them understand that it's outrageous and dangerously undemocratic behavior. But, Trump has mobilized the base of the Republican Party, and Republican senators and members of Congress fear crossing him.
And I mean, still in the same subject, do you think Donald Trump is more a symptom or a cause of the troubles in American democracy?
Well, I think he began as a symptom of the troubles, and he could not have gotten elected in 2016 as an outsider in the Republican Party primary process if there weren't serious troubles. But now that he is in office for 3 years and 7 months, he has become an important agent of democratic erosion and democratic jeopardy.
Do you see, I'm getting questions from the public, but one last question. Do you see a nexus between race, religion, and political preferences in the U.S.? In other words, do you see this, how easy it was for Donald Trump to hijack the Republican Party? Does this have to do with the perception from white America that there is an existential threat to them coming from a huge transformation of American society, both in cultural and ethnical terms?
The answer is yes, and it's a very big part of the problem. Trump, of course, as you know, has significantly less than 10% support among African Americans. Latino support or Latinx support is now overwhelmingly aligned against him with the Democratic Party as well. Asian Americans, many of whom are, very business oriented and like parts of the Latinx community, more culturally conservative. There should be fertile grounds for voter recruitment for Republicans. But again, Trump has pursued, I'd say, at least an implicitly racist political tone that has been quite alarming, certainly to Chinese Americans and others. And now the Democratic vice presidential candidate, her mother was from India, her father was from Jamaica, and Trump is spewing this absurd lie again that maybe she isn't qualified legally to be vice president or president. So under Trump, the Republican Party has taken a dangerous turn, Sergio, in the direction of what you are suggesting, in the direction of racial politics, racial implicit messaging, at least, and an intense and ultimately, I think, incredibly self-defeating effort to use racial, what we call dog whistles, implicit signals to intensively mobilize white voters out of fear of becoming, a political minority, while alienating voters of color. This is a losing proposition for the Republican Party because we're on our way to becoming a majority minority country in which African Americans, Latinx, Asian Americans, and others will, someday compose a majority of the electorate. And Trump seems to think that the only way he can be reelected is to suppress the vote of racial minorities so that the dwindling number of white voters will, back him and he can ride to power that way. This is, from any kind of standpoint of democratic inclusion, social justice, decency, civility, it's an ugly and un-American strategy, but this is the one he is obviously pursuing. And so we are seeing a host of efforts. We have seen them for years to try to win by doing as much as possible to suppress the vote in general and the vote of racial minorities in particular.
Larry, I'm going to bring a question from the public, from Eduardo Viola, who is a retired professor of political science at the University of Brasilia. and he's searching for a sort of silver lining. You've mentioned that the pandemic has been used by some authoritarian leaders to concentrate even stronger powers in their hands. Viola is asking in the opposite direction. If the good performance of democratic governments in Europe, if this does not bode well in terms of consolidating, at least in Europe, a strong preference for liberal democratic regimes and curbing what was, until recently, sort of apparently an overwhelming right-wing wave that would flood Europe and destroy liberal democracy in its cradle?
Well, there's some possibility of that, but I think it is very premature to embrace that theory as a likely reality that can enable us to take a deep breath and relax. And I say this for the following reasons. Number one, as long as the pandemic is with us, or to put it differently, until we have a reliable vaccine that is broadly administered and can transform the pandemic into a much more limited threat to public health, we know there is the ability, and we're seeing it even in places like New Zealand and South Korea, for the pandemic to break out again and present a threat to public health. So we're never going to be at a point without a vaccine that is reliable, where, and in a globalized environment, where a country kind of gets towards zero, and then that's it, it's over, and it can relax. So we want to be careful about having any country, whether it's Germany or Norway or whatever it might be, or Italy, which turned the corner to some extent from becoming too celebratory and thinking that the problem is solved and they can all congratulate themselves. Secondly, even if they continue to do a good job of managing the pandemic, we are in a global economic recession, and that is affecting countries in Europe to some extent, not as severely as in the United States, but to some extent. And this is happening at a time where there's still immigration pressures and other anxieties with respect to the economy, social change, the polarizing influence of social media and so on that Monica raised, that have been driving support for right-wing authoritarian populism. And we need to be very careful in presuming that the battle is won. And I'll just conclude with two observations. Number one, the New York Times has recently published a deeply alarming news report about extreme far-right German penetration of the security and domestic intelligence forces in Germany, particularly by a far-right nationalist and ultra-nationalist and even neo-Nazi actors in the former East Germany, where this movement is particularly strong, who've penetrated even the most elite anti or counterterrorism domestic forces. This is a very, very frightening scenario, as you can imagine. And Germany has its work cut out for it to weed out this far-right extremist penetration of its domestic security forces. And secondly, you know, without effective overall economic governance and an empathetic messaging that embraces and offers hope to people on the margins, and they can be on the left margin or the right margin or just the unemployed margin, you know, there's always the danger that illiberal populism is going to be the alternative. And I will just note here that Macron is not particularly popular in France today. You know, you might say he's done a reasonable job of managing the virus, but he is coming from the more technocratic and globalization friendly center. And, you know, if he doesn't go into the next French presidential election with a strong record of performance and a growing economy and a sense that he has his ear close to the ground of suffering and anxiety among many sectors of the French population, we cannot dismiss the possibility, particularly with Russian assistance, that Marine Le Pen could still be elected president of France.
If we are okay to carry on this for 10, 15 minutes more, I have more questions here.
Okay.
All right, Monica, then all right, at the end. There is a question here, very interesting one from Marcos Wurtman. It's about the relationship between religion and politics. And he alludes to the fact that authoritarian leaders have been very skillful in sort of capturing the fancy of religious conservative people. We see this in the US, you see this here in Brazil, and it's a sort of joint critique it's a critique against modernity. It goes even beyond a critique of liberal democracy. How concerned you are about this nexus between authoritarianism and religious conservatism? Can we sort of rescue religion from the hands of authoritarian leaders, or liberals and more progressive people can only play defense in this regard?
Well, it's a really interesting and important question, and I think the questioner is quite right to note how common it is among authoritarian populist projects around the world. This has been happening not only with Donald Trump and the evangelical movement, Bolsonaro and religious conservatives or fundamentalists in Brazil. Orban and Putin have both tried to use the Orthodox Church, and Orban, I guess more generally, religious conservatives. Of course, the whole logic of Erdogan's rise to power was in Muslim religious conservative, not really fundamentalists, but very religious, culturally conservative voters. Netanyahu, I think, is an authoritarian populist in Israel, and he's been trying to do this with the Jewish analog, the ultra-Orthodox in Israel. So there's a commonality here that is very, very striking. Maybe it's not perfectly consistent, but there's a strong tendency. And I think the answer is, I was suggesting before, that the way to beat populism is to create strong and inclusive coalitions. And I think that extends to religion as well. The natural base of resistance to illiberal populism, and I think a lot of these democracies, is among people who are more secular in their orientation and in their beliefs. Either they're not particularly religious, or They have a more flexible and liberal religious orientation. This has been true, I think, throughout Central and Eastern Europe. By the way, the same trend in Poland with the Law and Justice Party. In Turkey, of course, in the United States, and so on. But we have to be open to and forge alliances with, I'd say, religiously faithful individuals and religious leaders who are very pious, take their religion very seriously, but are very conscientious in their belief in religion, and therefore see the moral inconsistency of backing a leader who's corrupt, and if I can put it this way, profoundly unchristian in the way that he relates to minorities, the poor, opposition, and so on. And therefore, there are new opportunities to pull these religious leaders, even though maybe they won't like quite the political positions on social issues of the opposition coalition. They might embrace it, at least temporarily, to get rid of a bad, authoritarian, and morally disgraceful ruler.
We are approaching the end of this session. There is one pending delicate issue here. You can take the fifth if you want, Larry. And the question is about Brazil. I know you look to Brazil from abroad, but would you like to share your view about the current state of Brazilian democracy with us? This is a question that was asked by Nicolas Merloni. Thank you, Nicolas.
Well, I want to be cautious in what I say. I'm not going to take the fifth. I want to be cautious in what I say because I lack expertise and I'm not following it closely. But the points I would make in bullet point fashion are, number one, that I think both Donald Trump, and so I'm really being self-critical here for the United States as well. Both Donald Trump and Jair Bolsonaro, I think, are authoritarian personalities in their values, their rhetoric, their styles, their contempt for the truth, their misogyny, their their rhetoric that certainly has racist implications, and their glorification of authoritarian rulers elsewhere. And in the case of Bolsonaro, of course, his glorification of the authoritarian past in Brazil and some of the appalling things that he said or is alleged to have said. And in this respect, I think that if democratic institutions were as weak in Brazil as they had become in Venezuela or Turkey, or certainly as they were in Russia, I would fear for the future of democracy in Brazil, and maybe it would be gone by now. But and I think I want to say that even if we have so far survived in terms of basically preserving electoral democracy and basically preserving media and civil freedom in each of our two countries, we should be very careful about exhaling a deep breath and saying, it's not that serious, the worst is over, we're going to survive it. As long as you have leaders in power, particularly in presidential systems, who lack commitment to democratic values and lack a really strong moral compass, you're in trouble. You've got a living danger that you need to be very vigilant to. And I say this about the United States, and I say this about Brazil. Secondly, I think that in some ways, Bolsonaro faces a more serious obstacle. Here I'm on weaker ground than the United States. Maybe I'm wrong about this, but Trump has taken control of a major political party and really turned it into his instrument. It's a shocking and I'd say deeply saddening phenomenon. And this is why people like John Kasich at the Democratic Convention last night have left the Republican Party, or at least endorsed Joe Biden as the Democratic nominee. Bolsonaro didn't have a major party, and I guess he's kind of rallied some support from other parties, but he doesn't have quite as ready and secure and coherent a political instrument behind him. Third, I think in each country we see, and the two sponsors here and the broader base of alliance around them reflect this, a very vigorous civil society and vigorous independent media that are pushing back against these illiberal tendencies and that represent a very strong ray of hope. But really the lesson, I think, of the last 10 years and of recent years, and certainly what I'm seeing in the United States is, yes, we can take some heart in the vigor of our institutions, but we really can't afford to take anything for granted. And we have a lot of work to do, both with public opinion and in the political and institutional arena, to ensure that authoritarian ambitions do not become authoritarian realities.
Let me just, in the name of the Cardoso Foundation, to thank you so much for this very thoughtful presentation and the ensuing conversation. It was really a delight. Thank you so much. And take good care of yourself. We need you. Mônica.
Likewise. You too.
Obrigada, Sérgio. Professor, eu gostaria de encerrar justamente resgatando a sua última passagem sobre a gente não se dar por satisfeitos em relação à democracia, às democracias, e mais do que isso, sobre a importância da arena política e da política institucional. Como eu abri comentando e falávamos no bastidor também, esta organização que hoje eu tenho o privilégio de dirigir é uma organização de natureza política. E estão nos assistindo aqui candidatos e candidatas, pré-candidatos e pré-candidatas, esse é o termo correto da nossa legislação hoje para ser utilizado, que vão disputar eleições a prefeito e vereador em novembro desse ano. E existem conosco hoje também muitos prefeitos e vereadores e deputados já no exercício dos mandatos também acompanhando essa discussão. Hoje é dia 18 de agosto e nós temos um cenário muito triste no Brasil. Primeiro, nós somos, junto com o seu país e o México, nós compomos a trinca dos países que têm desempenhado pior em relação à Covid. Nós hoje atingimos a marca de 109 mil mortes. E nós ontem tivemos uma pesquisa de um dos principais institutos de pesquisa no Brasil, demonstrando que a rejeição do brasileiro ao Congresso Nacional, que já é sempre alta, atingiu patamares ainda mais altos. Cerca de 37% dos brasileiros não aprova o Congresso Nacional. Eu gostaria, além de agradecer a sua presença em nome da RAPS e da Fundação Fernando Henrique Cardoso, agradecer à Fundação também pelo debate, eu gostaria, por favor, que o senhor encerrasse com uma mensagem aos líderes políticos brasileiros que passaram essa hora e meia conosco. Que mensagem, por favor, o senhor deixa a essas lideranças políticas num momento tão difícil como o nosso, seja pela crise sanitária, seja pelo estado da nossa democracia, Brasil e mundo. Super obrigada mais uma vez.
My message is, please remember that your ultimate loyalty, if you're going to have loyalty to your country and its future, your ultimate loyalty has to be to the democratic constitution and democratic norms over immediate political or party or personal objectives. In the to and fro, the back and forth of democracy, we'll have elections, and then we'll have 4 years later other elections, and there'll be plenty of opportunities for different parties to come to power and challenge one another and turn each other out of power and check each other back and forth and to negotiate different agreements and compromises on budgets and other policy objectives. But if we lose our democracy and if we lose our freedom, that's something that can last a very long time and unravel the potential for the country to move forward and for the country to remain stable for a very long time. So this is something that I think politicians everywhere in the United States and Brazil, even in Europe and so on, have to keep reminding ourselves that our highest loyalty has to be to the norms and institutions of democracy. And if we don't sustain those, democracy becomes highly vulnerable. And this is how democracy is lost.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much,
Larry. Hope to see you in person in the near future.
Me too.
Stay safe.
Thank you.
Ok. Mônica, obrigado. Foi ótimo.
Obrigada, Sérgio. Obrigada a todo mundo que nos assiste.
Maravilha. Obrigado pela parceria.